Hello there, kiota. Welcome to this week's Omnibus edition, where it has been a pretty strange, very full-on week. This week's content includes looking at the difference between prime ministers in the time of an emergency, the debate between David Seymour and Helmut Modlik, and the working group and how they put all that together, which has been really highly viewed and really full of racist bullshit from people. It's disgusting, to be quite honest. There was a whole bunch of other stuff as well about the downfall of TVNZ not becoming Netflix and other things. So I don't know. Check out the menu. There's a list with links and times in it. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You know, all the usual stuff. So enjoy this week's Omnibus. Hello there, kia ora. During the last Labour government, the country had to deal with some pretty major events. There was a terrorist attack, an eruption, COVID, the illegal Wellington occupation, Cyclone Gabriel, and a massive weather event that caused the deaths of 4 people in Tamaki Makaurau. And that last one occurred within 2 days of Chris Hipkins being made Prime Minister after the resignation of Dame Jacinda Ardern. For a new Prime Minister, it was a trial by, well, water. And for some, after the election delivered a change of government, there were concerns about how a new Prime Minister would handle our next natural disaster. After all, he was unproven, inexperienced, and, well, Chris Luxon has a habit of looking at the world through the lens of corporate drivers and motivators. How would he react to a disaster that required real leadership, quick action, and empathy? Well, we got our answer this weekend. Otago saw the most rainfall it's seen in over 100 years. Streets flooded, houses have been red-stickered, there's been road closures, slips, power outages, and infrastructure breakdowns. And thankfully, things are starting to return to normal as Dunedin Council staff work around the clock to get everything back to the way it was. Now, if we cast our mind back to the fatal weather event in Auckland 2 days after Chris Hipkins got the job, well, we see that Hipkins was using social media to keep people informed. The stand-up of Wellington Civil Defence Bunker, the directions to keep safe, updates from Civil Defence, keeping people informed as he tried to get to the region, and updates from within the region from MPs within the city, with info about shelters, recovery plans, and anything else that might be pertinent for people within the impacted zone. So what happened this weekend while Otago flooded? Well, our Prime Minister wished the Jewish community a Happy New Year for Rosh Hashanah. He then promoted the new Family Start ECE rebate scheme. He then told people of Otago that he's thinking about them and to listen to Civil Defence. He then showed off his tuxedo as he went to an event in Auckland the night the city flooded, and then congratulated Todd McClay for winning a prize at that event. On Facebook, since his Thoughts and Prayers post, he posted smiling handshake pictures from a private hospital and told people parking in disabled spots is bad. Nothing about the Otago recovery, where those impacted could seek help, what his South Island MPs are doing to help voters, or any help being offered by central government. Now, that may be because, well, this government gutted the Climate Change Emergency Fund to pay for their landlord tax cuts. At the moment, the people of Otago are mad about their hospital, mad at the government for the decision they announced, but they also need a leader to step up and be a leader. When the worst happens, whether that is when the population are happy or unhappy with them. A leader needs to put aside politics and personal feelings and put people first. But I guess that's not always possible to fit into the 42-point action plans full of bringing the energy and taking decisions of being the CEO of New Zealand. Hello there, kia ora. Last night, the working group hosted what they touted as iwi versus Piwi, a debate about the Treaty Principles Bill. In it, ACT leader, and the subject of 25% of all mainstream media mentions in this country around politicians, David Seymour, debated his bill with Ngātai Toa's Helmut Modlik. The spin-off called it David versus a Goliath of Māoridom as they live blogged from the studio. What the event really ended up being, though, was a debate around the argument over whether or not Māori ceded sovereignty, which they didn't. But David Seymour would never accept that. He kept arguing that he wants equal rights for everyone, no matter their race, under the rule of a sovereign head of state who has separate rights, like the right to never be arrested or sued. Which, sounds logical, but it's actually a reframing of Te Tiriti. After all, it wasn't an agreement between races, it's a treaty about governance that promised equitable outcomes between peoples of two nations. One of those nations was represented by the monarch, the other was represented by rangatira from all over the motu. Now, for most of the audience, this debate will not change their perspective. Those opposed to Seymour and his plan will say Helmut won with his use of context around history, research, and experience. Those who support Seymour will say that they felt he won hands down. What Seymour did do was use a litany of disinformation to argue his point, from his claim that Māori ceded sovereignty through to his right-wing stables of criticising academics and experts, and even pulled a J.D. Vance at one stage claiming he was focusing on the future, not the past. He even claimed that the 1981 Springbok riots were a whole nation united against apartheid, a very rose-tinted look at an event that, well, is definitely not like that. In fact, rugby fans hunted protesters after the Hamilton riot, vandalised their homes, and attacked some protesters at night on the streets. One of those protesters was actually Timi Maipi, the grandfather of our youngest MP, Hana Rafati Maipi-Clark. Misrepresenting history to create an idealised version of the past, to build his idealised version of the future, is a shaky place for Seymour to make an argument from, but it's how he's approached this topic for quite some time. He and his proxies have used a lot of nostalgia-fueled perspectives to justify their arguments. And in the chat, that was evident. One user, calling themselves Pacific Ocean, repeated dozens of times the single line, Sir Apirana Ngata. Ngata is held by the most extreme racist supporters of Act's actions as a good Māori, because while he had great mana, early in his career he was a believer that Māori ceded sovereignty. He wasn't an expert on the document and not an academic or constitutional expert on the topic, and rose to prominence at a time when assimilation into the dominant European culture was seen by many as the only way to survive for Māori. That's why the rich people behind the NZCPR were so keen to seek donations to get it printed and put on the front of major newspapers for free. The pro-Seymour audience was adamant he won, and while many would argue that feelings don't matter, they clearly don't seem to think facts matter either. But there's a sign or two that in the long run, Seymour's likely to be the biggest loser due to his own determination to drag this out as long as he can. Last week, the NZ Herald published their Vibes of the Boardroom that looks at the feelings of CEOs of a bunch of companies. Like the business confidence survey that they do, it showed corporate donors of the coalition who dumped $15 million on them last year to help them get elected, despite all evidence it would result in, well, just look around, are suddenly really optimistic about a tanking economy and surging unemployment and increasing poverty rates. But they're also really annoyed with David Seymour and his culture war talking points. They find it a distraction from the important job of making them richer and, the economy and stuff. And many are turning off from the ACT Party for its inability to focus on real issues, not the ones ACT read about on their angry boomer Facebook posts. But with this bill likely to be in the news for the next 7 months, possibly longer, those donors to his party are far less likely to fund his campaign next election or lend him their private planes. The racist ones might, the ones who felt the debate warranted the use of the N-word to support Seymour's perspective in the chat. But if he keeps relying on misremembered history, incorrect data, and pushing for things that his most prominent local donors are sick of hearing, well, that's going to be a headache for him come election fundraising time, and maybe beyond. Hello there, kia ora. It doesn't take a genius to see our health system is in trouble. It feels like it's being set up to fail, with privatisation being the end goal. And we've already seen comments around how, well, we might have no choice but to accept it because the people in charge, the ones who have links directly to private health providers, have told us it looks like the only way to save the system. After all, it was just last week that Health NZ was urging the government to look at private-public partnerships to save the Dunedin Hospital. And because the government keeps bringing up other hospitals that need work, like Whangarei and Nelson, well, why wouldn't we think that privatisation would help them as well? Look, none of this is a surprise. ACT has long pushed for these kind of partnerships despite all the evidence that they cost more and deliver less. But there's another tool in the belt of those pushing for this that they've been using, and many haven't picked up on it. It's the language they use. You see, we keep hearing about deficits in budgets, shortfalls in available funding for, well, everything. It's very selective language designed by those that push it to make us consider Health NZ funding in terms of a business or household budget, which it clearly isn't. Shortfalls in finances for a core service is an issue with underallocated funding. At the budget in May, for example, the government promoted the increase they gave to Whatu Ora as the biggest budget they had ever had. And that's technically true, but it equates to a 0.6% increase on the last annual budget, when inflation nationally was sitting at around 5% and medical inflation was even higher. That's what economists call a real-world funding decline. Even if you compare our expenditure on health compared to other OECD countries, you'll see it's comparatively low, and it has been for decades across successive governments. So, what we're seeing in the healthcare system is a systemic problem that's being made worse by decisions that this government and its proxies have made. But don't worry, they can talk about it like a business and slip in new phrases, like the one that Lester Levy used on RNZ this week. Gone is the no frontline staffing cuts, and in its place is no drop in frontline expenditure. It's another line that sounds sort of fine and kind of the same, but it doesn't take into consideration the steady salary increases that are needed to maintain staff as the cost of living's gone up. A cost of living that's been exacerbated so much by this government that the Reserve Bank felt forced to drop the official cash rate by 50 points this week to help people increase spending because it had been throttled too much by fiscal policy and decisions which have seen catastrophic levels of unemployment and loss of income. So saying the amount they're willing to spend on keeping good staff and adding to them won't change is another cut because they refuse to fund frontline staff properly. You complain that there's too many in the wrong place, not enough people leaving soon enough, and that there's also no technical hiring freeze for those frontline staff despite all the evidence that it is clearly something that's happening. When the reality is this could be avoided if the government had actually funded this core service properly, right from the beginning. But there's tax cuts to pay for. So our health sector and economy will have to suffer a little while longer. But it's not all doom and gloom. Apparently Health NZ will be out of deficit by next year. Once again implying it's a business and not severely underfunding a piece of core infrastructure for the country. Ooh, a fancy transition. Look, this week we're not doing a full Behind the Walls live on Friday night. Blake and I are having a bit of time off. But on Saturday, we're doing a special live discussion for YouTube members with political commentator Matt Tukaki on YouTube. You can head over to the channel to join us from 8 p.m. when we're going to look at the aftermath of the working group debate. And members can ask him some questions like, why do some people refuse to believe Māori never ceded sovereignty? Or why do some people think David Seymour is good because he annoys people who don't think the word woke is an insult? Or why do some people refuse to actually accept history and the documents that we've got and want to find ways to delegitimize them? So come join us 8 p.m. Saturday night on YouTube. Join the conversation. We might have a little surprise lined up for you afterwards as well. So go check out those links sitting in the bio at the moment. Hello there, kia ora. Pour one out for the TVNZ news website. It's on the chopping block because TVNZ needs to find $30 million. It's an amount so big you can actually count the number of times it's been a prize in lotto on one hand. The website itself is just one of a number of changes being proposed as the state broadcaster looks to continue their transformation into the digital age of streaming with less of a focus on linear broadcast. But there's a real risk involved as well, that we end up with a partially state-funded Netflix knockoff. And I don't just mean in a way that, essentially sets up another paid subscription service for content that produces 6 episodes of a show every 2 years for us to binge in a night and still somehow manages to lose millions of dollars. What we've seen in the US and the UK is a model that's based on paid subscription services, that they throw out advertising and weekly release schedule and branding opportunities that bring in actual funding, because that's how changing audiences interact with media now. So it's become an expectation that makes it almost impossible to ensure any kind of profitability. That model was actually designed specifically to kill profit from traditional broadcasters, like TVNZ. But that profit also means investment in areas like our news services. Well, it's kind of in question. In the past 12 months, we've already seen the loss of NewsHub and industry shrinkage as audience models change. Because while the way audiences connect with content might be evolving, there's a universal truth in there that more people would rather get something for free than pay for it. It's why we might roll our eyes at advertising on TikTok or YouTube, but the vast majority would rather deal with those ads than pay for a premium service, which is what the traditional broadcast model for TV was. And there are ways TVNZ could bring back profits as they evolve, especially if they're cognizant of the traps of replicating the Netflix model that Disney, Amazon, Paramount Plus, the BBC, and others have fallen into. But they all cost money, which TVNZ doesn't have. Original fiction and non-fiction content that has weekly releases, paid and unpaid user options for constant access that also appeals to advertisers, genre types that aren't the focus of other providers like reality and game shows, late night infotainment talk shows, and live sports. All of these have growing audiences online, after all, and finding niche markets and growing those, and focusing on genres like science fiction or rainbow programming or nostalgia fueled content. They're all options that could work, but a lack of funds also means less willingness to try new things. The risk is just too high. Our access to news is important. It's what keeps us informed and helps us make better informed decisions. But the model we have here for TVNZ relies on funding from outside of the government to supplement the specific government funding to provide a news service. They're symbiotic. And if one doesn't perform, the other simply isn't viable to maintain. But 30 million is a lot to risk on drastic change, especially when this is somewhat uncharted territory. But if we end up with a Netflix clone, our main source of local content from TVNZ, well, it's going to fail. And it doesn't have that Netflix level of money to save it. Hello there, kia ora. Let's take a look at some of the news that's happened this week. Last Sunday, the country was awoken by a 5.7 scale earthquake felt all over the islands, centred just off the Wellington coast. Because local conspiracy theorists haven't had much to do lately, emergency services were also in town for a training exercise where a fictional earthquake in the high 5-point range just off the coast of the city was meant to be used to help them train. According to one source, this coincidence will help keep the conspiracy theorist groups going until at least Christmas, when they'll then turn their attention to seasonal weather patterns and chemtrails again. To try and calm down the conspiracy theorists in the meantime and make them feel more comfortable, Wellington wastewater pipes burst outside of Parliament to remind them of their time illegally occupying the area in 2022. In Samoa, the NZ Navy ship Manawanui sank after hitting a reef and catching fire. Thankfully, all hands were able to abandon ship safely with only minor injuries, but the risk of a major ecological event occurring increases every day the ship and its fuel supply are underwater. The event led to a wave of misogyny-filled content on social media because the captain of the ship is a gay woman. Defence Minister Judith Collins called out this behaviour in a press conference on Thursday, explaining the actions of Commander Yvonne Gray had saved the lives of those on board, and that armchair admirals who get so upset at a woman in charge they have a meltdown online when it happens, they're probably a little too emotional to serve. Unfortunately for Collins, the calls are coming from inside the house. You see, she didn't seem to realise that the most prominent of those online voices are right-wing trolls that voted for her and her coalition partners. Te Whatu Ora this week was revealed to be proposing to cut up to $100 million in much-needed data and digital infrastructure work as part of their ongoing mission to tank the health sector with underfunding and then say it's like running a business. Issues with IT and data management were cited as part of the reason apparently nurses cost too much, with fragmented data points from outdated IT systems not allowing the organisation to get a clear picture of actual staff and payroll outgoings. When approached for comment, a spokesperson for the IT industry said, "You look like you're destroying the healthcare system. Are you sure you want to proceed?" The government financial books were open this week, revealing a worse situation financially than was initially expected. While the budget deficit was expected, the actual deficit was $1.8 billion more than forecast, and government expenses were almost $5 billion over forecast due to high inflation and interest rates over the past 12 months. Naturally, the government blamed Labour for everything bad in the announcement, and the reporting period does cover some of the time that they were in power. But a major driver of the numbers was the forced slowdown of the economy on company profits and an increase in wage settlements and pensions being paid out. An increase in benefit payments and higher unemployment were also factors for the outcome. Said Finance Minister Nicola Willis, seen here showing you how to pull the lever on the trolley problem to run over the most people most efficiently, said, "Look, we re-index benefits to inflation, which means that beneficiaries will be getting less help from now on for the good of the country." The Coalition this week revealed a list of 149 projects picked for fast-tracking under their new controversial fast-tracking process after requests began in March to find out the list. The list included the roof for Eden Park, a second bridge for Ashburton, a new dry dock for the Navy, and a number of housing build projects. It also includes several zombie projects brought back from the dead after they failed the resource consent process, like the Trans-Tasman Resources Plan to extract seabed material on a spot where offshore wind turbines are also meant to be going. While details around how conflict of interest was managed by ministers with self-declared conflicts leaving the room for deliberations in a move Greenpeace described as messy, it was also revealed that $500,000 in donations were made to coalition parties from individuals and organisations with projects on the list. When asked about the appearance of potential conflicts of interest, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, seen here wondering why the press would be asking him questions, said, "We have absolute standards, and it's mission critical in New Zealand that we can trust our government and our governance. That's what's built our success in our system. As soon as you start to have relative standards..." Oh, wait, no, sorry, that's what he said about Michael Wood's Auckland Airport shares. Public health experts this week rejected claims by Associate Health Minister for Smoking, Casey Costello, that heated tobacco products would help up to 7,000 hardcore smokers quit, saying her evidence released last week was not backed by peer-reviewed research-based examples. The minister's faced regular pushbacks from academics and lobby groups for her seemingly tobacco-friendly policy stance and her seemingly mysterious official advice that just shows up out of nowhere. When asked this week about the issues with Costello and other problematic MP Nicole McKee, Luxon said, "What we've seen time and time again is a series of ministers, former ministers, not understanding cabinet manuals, codes of conduct, and actually not internalising that and taking action on it." Oh, sorry, that was also something else he said about Michael Wood's shares. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, seen here putting on protective gear so he doesn't get hurt when he crashes the economy, this week put a third rental property on the market, this time in Onehunga. This is the third property in 3 months Luxon has put on the market. He recently came under fire for the sale of 2 other properties, one of which fell outside of the newly reduced Brightline test limits that he changed, raising questions around conflicts of interest and untaxed capital gains he made. As the conversation around capital gains tax gains momentum, opposition parties have said, "We'll just sit back and let our wealthy sorted Prime Minister keep making the case for us." Luxon said, "It actually leads to perceptions of bias, rightly or wrong. I just say to you that that's the perception. Whether it's real or not doesn't matter." Oh, sorry, that's actually what he said about Winston Peters' claim that the Labour government had bribed the media. Luxon does not comment on his rental properties. A new report out this week from Stats NZ showed that the average cost of food has continued to rise, with a 0.6% overall increase on figures released in March. The biggest drivers for this were the cost of imported goods like olive oil and chocolate, while the price of fresh fruit and vegetables decreased as seasonal availability and stock resilience after Cyclone Gabriel returned to relative normality. The same report showed that while fuel prices are down, rent prices have increased 4.6% in the last 12 months, net disposable income has dropped 0.9%, household utility bills had increased, as had insurance premiums, primary healthcare, flight costs, childcare, and entertainment options. A spokesperson for the government said, "We are laser focused on the cost of living crisis." right after we let New Zealand First continue to vilify trans people wanting to get involved in community sport and act whip up racism with its Treaty Principles Bill. And finally, over the next week, New Zealanders should be able to see Comet C/2023A3, also known as Shu-Shin-Shan Atlas, with the naked eye from next week, with it passing nearest to Earth on Sunday morning. Scientists believe the comet tail is made up of cyanide and did have carbon which has been depleted as it heated up on approaching the Sun. In astronomical terms, the comet will be relatively close to the planet, but there is no risk of impact, said New Zealand First spokesperson for science denying Tanya Unkovic, seen here telling people how big the needles were for the COVID vaccine and that's why it killed everyone it touched. Clearly, this is a sign from the gods that our plan to ignore science and vilify academics and experts and bring into question the curriculum of our schools is paying off, and we should continue to do so, for it is the will of the great god Offa. And that, everybody, is the news for this week. Hey guys, thanks for checking out this week's Omnibus, really appreciate it. Now I'm going to let you in on a little bit of a secret since you managed to get all the way through to the end of the video. I've been hiding horror Easter eggs in some of the films. Not going to tell you which ones, not going to tell you which episodes, but between now and the end of October, you should be able to collect a full series of horror movie icons in every other video out there. So keep an eye out for those. There is one that showed up in at least the Omnibus edition that I know of. So keep an eye out. I'm not going to tell you where they are, but let me know if you find them. It's super fun. Alright guys, until next week, have a fantastic time. Live long and prosper. Catch you all later. Here. The link to other things that come at the end of YouTube videos.